Jesús, Maranatha, ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha, ven Señor. Okay, well, thanks for joining me. Today's show is in some sense centered on the Enlightenment, which I'd like to call the Endarkenment, but we'll get into that. But in fact, we will be talking about the Enlightenment. Of course, the central focus is going to be the effect on Judaism, but the Enlightenment is inseparable from the revolutions that overthrew the Christian monarchies in Europe, and that set the stage for democracy, but also set the stage for basically a godless structure of society. Anyway, okay, the show, the Enlightenment. I'm going to have to back up. I will get back to the Masonic conspiracy to take over the world and to foment revolution and so forth. But I have to backfill. I have to set the stage. And the stage is the Enlightenment or the Endarkenment. Now, the Enlightenment is usually, it's usually considered beginning in the 1700s, beginning of the 18th century. But actually, it traces its roots a little bit further back. And you could say the middle of the 16th, tail end of the 16th century. Because that's when a science kind of started coming into its own. And there were two scientists in the late 16th century who, one of them did a book, his name is Andreas Vesalius, who did a very, very notable book on the human body named De Corporis, which is actually based on vivisection, which I think was the first time that vivisection was used. In other words, cutting up a dead body to figure out exactly what's going on in the body to the extent possible. I'll show you one of the illustrations from his book. But you can see how carefully he kind of mapped out the mechanical working of the body. And so that, in a couple of moments, I'll say why that's interesting. Now, and then actually in the same year that came out, in the middle of the 16th century, came out a book by somebody who's much better known in world circles and in Catholic circles, who was Copernicus, who came out with his book. There's a portrait of Copernicus. There is an illustration from his book of the planets revolving around the sun. And of course, that was rather revolutionary because until then, the consensus was that the Earth was the center, essentially, of the solar system, and that the sun revolved around the Earth, and the planets, in some mysterious way, rotated in a very complex pattern around the Earth, because, of course, their movement could be observed enough to know that they weren't going in neat circles around the Earth, so there had to be lots of special explanations. But Copernicus published his book in 1543 on the revolutions, De Revolutionibus. That's not the revolutions of the French Revolution, but the revolutions, obviously, of the planets, where he outlined the science of how the planets, including the Earth, revolve around the sun in the solar system. And then within a couple of decades, by the way, note, this was not Galileo. Two notes to be made here. There were earlier scientists long before Galileo who also described the Copernican system of the planets, including the Earth, revolving around the sun. They were not condemned by the church. They were not examined by the Inquisition. They didn't get in trouble with the church. And all of the scientists that I'm going to mention in this period leading up to the Enlightenment, they were all devout. Okay, they were all serious Catholics. As a matter of fact, they all wrote at how, you see, you can look at a beautiful flower and say, admire the beauty and wisdom and expressiveness of God, right? Look at a field of flowers. I'm overwhelmed. We don't live in all that much wild nature anymore. But I remember hiking in the Alps, in the high alpine fields. And the meadows are blanketed with the most extraordinary, beautiful, delicate flowers. Hundreds of varieties, hundreds of colors. This is wasteland. Nobody's there. This is above tree line. Just God showing his generosity and his creativeness and his beauty. And of course, people in those days lived. They lived in nature. They could see God's wisdom and his generosity, his brilliance and his beauty in the creation of nature. Then along come these scientists who are faithful Catholics. Maybe I'll do a show on Catholic science, actually. It's very interesting. Most of the originators, most of the key figures in science leading up to the 20th century were seriously religious, including religious meaning, I have a problem. Anyway, that's not what the show's about, so I won't talk about my technical difficulties. Let's just hope that was all spiritual warfare, because somebody doesn't like what I'm doing. But anyway, where was I? I was talking about Copernicus, and I was talking about these early scientists. And what was so neat is they were seriously religious. And I was talking about how we can see God's wisdom and beauty and generosity in the flowers. When they discovered the order of the universe, the beautiful mechanical working of the planets revolving around the sun and so forth, they all saw it as giving God more glory, his wisdom being reflected in the laws of mechanics and the laws of physics, in calculus, which is incredibly beautiful in its own way, in the laws of chemistry and the working of the human body. They as scientists did not take this to mean that there is no God. They took it to mean, wow, look at all these new ways we see God's wisdom and his generosity and his beauty. Okay? So I did want to just set that. And so there you have Copernicus, and there you have Copernicus. You don't need Copernicus over and over and over again, I guess. And then came a half a generation later, Kepler. And Kepler really established the laws of planetary motion. He explained a lot of anomalies, a lot of things that were hard to explain. And I want to see if I have, I'll put up a portrait of him. Looks like a very intense, interesting man. And he was very religious, and he saw it all as redounding to the glory of God. In fact, he was a polymath. Whoops, I'm off the screen, so I'll get back. He was a polymath, meaning he was a scientist in a number of different areas. And he was very interested in geometry and in the perfection of geometry. And I'll just put up the quote because I'm not going to do it justice. First, I'm going to put up the picture first. He realized, or he discovered, that the Platonic polyhedral forms could all be contained and described as being contained in perfect spheres. And he saw this as a reflection of God's plan for the universe. So here's the short quote. Kepler reasoned that regular polygons bound one inscribed in one circumscribed circle at definite ratios might be the geometrical basis of the universe. He thought that he had revealed God's geometrical plan for the universe. His enthusiasm for the Copernican system stemmed from his theological convictions about the connection between the physical and the spiritual. The universe itself was an image of God, the Son corresponding to the Father, the stellar sphere to the Son, and the intervening space between to the Holy Spirit. His Mysterium, that was a book of his, contained an extensive chapter reconciling heliocentrism, that's the word for the Sun being the center of the solar system, with biblical passages that seem to support geocentrism. So why am I doing this? Why I'm talking about this is because it is utter nonsense to claim that the faith is contrary to science or is at odds with science or whatever. And whenever these early scientists in their discoveries, they simply took it to confirm their faith in God, so to speak, not to contradict it. This is a myth of our society that somehow they're at odds. This theme will recur in the show. Anyway, so moving on, I'll get to the most controversial, I guess, of these pre-Enlightenment scientists, which is Galileo. And I'm not going to go into. You all know about Galileo. You know about the telescope. You know about him arguing that the sun was the center of the universe. My understanding is that he was not, because I like portraits. Here's a portrait of Galileo. But my understanding is that he was not actually condemned by the Inquisition for the heliocentrism, which had already been expressed within the church, but in fact, because of what he said about the meaning of sacred scripture. I think he went a little bit too far in asserting principles of critical biblical scholarship, let's say. However, just to give evidence that he too was religious, this is a quote of his alongside a copy of the book that on the sun being the center of the solar system. God is known by nature in his works and by doctrine in his revealed word. Doesn't sound very, atheist or skeptical to me. And he was reconciled with the church. Oh, by the way, again, just because I like portraits, here is a portrait of his daughter, okay, who, as you can easily see, became a Catholic nun. I forgot the name of this one of his daughters. And he was reconciled with the church. In fact, his tomb was moved to be in a church, I believe it's in Florence. There's his tomb. But I couldn't resist. There's a relic of his that when his body was moved, pieces of people's bodies are removed to be relics. So here's a relic of his in a reliquary. Now, you'll have to excuse me, but I couldn't help finding it very curious that what they took from the body to be the relic for this reliquary was in fact a single finger. And it was the middle finger of his right hand that is sticking straight up in the reliquary. Here I've zoomed in, okay? So can I be forgiven for thinking that somebody thought it might be cute if Galileo was kind of giving the finger to the people who condemned him? Post-mortem, anyway. Blah, blah, blah. So, okay, would be spending too much time kind of needlessly beating a dead horse on this if I went on and on and on and on. So let me just race through. Okay, then we had in the second half of the 17th century, we had Newton, who came up with calculus and gravitational attraction and the fact that white light is a mixture of colors and optics and so forth. Sir Isaac Newton was very interested in theology, in fact, in prophecy also. And he wrote some kind of I don't want to say mystical, because that's got a bad rap, but he wrote some prophetic, some exegesis, biblical exegesis, where he went heavily into prophecy. There's a portrait of Newton. And I don't know if I have the quote from it. I don't have the quote from him. But he suggested in one of his unpublished works, he tried to figure out when the end of the world would be. And he came up with 2060, the year 2060. So I'm not saying we should take him seriously just because he was so good with gravity and light and optics. But it's interesting that he was so religious that he took the biblical prophecy so seriously that he went to the effort of trying to figure out when the end of the world was. And he had a lot of other theological interests. Then we have Leibniz around the same time, who independently discovered calculus. Now, this is very interesting for another reason, because you see this over and over again, that major scientific discoveries, in this case mathematical discoveries, that create a leap forward in civilization, very often are discovered simultaneously by different people in different places in the world, virtually the same year, which suggests that it is in fact the working of God, and that he has a plan for the unfolding of human civilization, and he allows or orchestrates these giant steps forward at the right time. And perhaps as evidence that it isn't simply happenstance, he does it simultaneously through different people at the same point in time. Leibniz did not plagiarize Newton. Newton didn't plagiarize Leibniz, but in virtually the same year, they both came up with calculus. So I find that very interesting. Now, okay, now Leibniz was also intensely religious. Here's a portrait of him. I suspect that's not his real hair. He developed differential and integral calculus, invented the first mass-produced mechanical calculator, which I'll actually show you, refined the binary number system, which is the basis for computers, binary arithmetic, binary logic. And there is his early calculator, which could, I believe, multiply and divide as well as add. So, do I have a quote? I don't have his quote. I didn't put up, well, I guess I didn't think I'd need to show them. But he's also famous. Leibniz is also famous for, I must have that. I cannot not have that quote. Please bear with me a moment. I must have that quote. Oh boy, I'm going to be hung on the petard of always being called amateur hour, because I don't have that quote. Anyway, that this is the best of all possible worlds, because God, being all good and absolutely perfect, would not have created a world which was not the best of all possible worlds, and he certainly would be in a position to know whether this was the best of all possible worlds, and therefore we are in the best of all possible worlds. Now, this principle, which was introduced by Leibniz, obviously he was a very religious man, was mocked at the time of the Enlightenment, in particular by Voltaire, whose play Candide repeatedly goes back to the refrain of the best of all possible worlds, showing all kinds of horrors and making fun of the concept that this is the best of all possible worlds. Anyway, but that came from Leibniz. By the way, Leibniz was a real big-time scientist, and Voltaire was just a literary figure who died in very unfortunate circumstances. Anyway, so I think we have reason to take Leibniz a little bit more seriously than Voltaire, who could do no more than mock him. By the way, getting back to that letter I read at the beginning of the show, I think we see that even today. We see that when the bad guys don't have much of a response to what they're objecting to, all they can do is mock. Oh boy. I hope I'm still in sync. I hope that little technical glitch didn't put me out of sync. Guys, let me know in the chat stream if I'm out of sync. And I know how to fix that, although it means going offline for, a half a minute or so. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of jump forward. Well, one more figure in this pre-Enlightenment, yes, in sync, good, I'm good, which is Spinoza, because Spinoza was actually, of course, he was a religious figure. He was also a Jew. Here's a picture of Spinoza. And he was essentially a pantheist. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit and say why this is interesting, at least to me, which is all of these scientists that I've mentioned were seriously religious. However, the problem wasn't with them. The problem was with basically what the forces of society did with the introduction of this science. Because before you had this science, let's take the example of the movement of the earth, or the movement of the sun around the earth, as they thought, and the movement of the planets. Well, for centuries, people just figured, oh, well, God's moving the planets. God's moving the sun. The Psalms that talk about that, right? The sun leaving its tent at the beginning of the day and galloping across the sky and going back into its tent at the end of the day or whatever. And so people didn't worry too much about this, just how God worked, and God was doing everything. And the direct cause of everything in nature and, in the way the universe worked was just straight from the hand of God. Now, all of a sudden, these scientists brilliantly show that there is an incredibly beautiful, sophisticated order and pattern that God put into the workings of the universe. So the motion of the planets, for instance, isn't God taking his hand and, pushing Venus when he feels like it. It is actually that the planets are obeying sophisticated, regular laws. To the scientists, it showed the wisdom of God. But to the hoi polloi, to many of them, and to the people who wanted to do away with God, it meant we don't need God for an explanation. The scientists have given us an explanation. They didn't really give them an explanation that went down to the fundament, because somebody had to come up with the laws and so forth, intelligent design of everything. As a matter of fact, Sir Isaac Newton talked about intelligent design, that these laws, in fact, reflect intelligent design. But to the people who wanted to do away with God, they could just claim that these things were themselves sufficient explanation, so that the hypothesis of God no longer had to be entertained. That's why this is so interesting. And it's an abuse of the science, because, in fact, the science does not do away with the need for a designer. Where you see an intelligent design, you can conclude there's an intelligent designer. However, a more naive view said that, well, the intelligent design itself was the root cause. Now, this resulted in something known as Deism, which is basically a God. I think the normal picture is that the divine clockmaker, that God designed the universe, wound up the clock, and then went away. So he's not involved with mankind. He's not involved with the universe. He just created this clockwork mechanism of the universe. That'll get into Spinoza in a moment. But the point I want to make is, if the universe is this incredibly complex, interrelated, brilliantly conceived, incredibly complex clock, there must at least be a clockmaker. The fact that it works like clockwork does not erase the need for God. At the very worst, it suggests that God is a clockmaker and isn't involved in the day-to-day activities. That's the worst you can go with it. You can't go to wiping away God. And this is true, by the way, even in evolution. I'm not going to get into evolution in this show, but the intelligent design stream of research, whatever you want to call it, it's not creationist per se. It's not basing itself on creationism. It's not saying on theological grounds that what we see in the natural world, what we see in the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom and so forth, is the work of God. It is saying that simply on the scientific merits, on the scientific basis of the way life works, it can't have created itself. It can't have sprung by itself. It shows an intelligent designer behind it. And it restricts itself to the science. That's why it's referred to as intelligent design. It's not just a clever PR ploy by creationists to hang on to creationism under a different name. It's not basing itself at all on a theological principle. It is basing itself on scientific principles and showing that where you have intelligent design, which could not come about randomly or stepwise, you had to have a designer. Anyway, so much for not talking about evolution. However, on to Spinoza, because Spinoza is kind of an intermediary figure, because Spinoza somehow hung on to the vaguest sense of the existence of a God without that God having any real meaning in the world or in man's life. He was essentially a pantheist, and I will just put up a quote of his. I talked about this before, so this is kind of a review. God is the indwelling and not the transient cause of things. All things which are in God. Besides God, there can be no substance. Nothing in itself is external to God. Basically, God is contained in creation. There is no personal God. There is no, the appealing thing to deism, and even more so to pantheism, is when people want to get rid of God, what they usually want to get rid of is the laws of morality and the voice of their conscience. You see that today all over the place, okay? The reason for getting rid of God is because really, without God, there is, I don't want to say there's no reason for morality. You could make an argument for morality, but you could probably have a tough time making an argument around sexual morality. So usually the fundamental drive for getting rid of God is that once you get rid of God, you can yield yourself to your passions entirely. And I'm going to get out of sequence here a little bit, because I'm obviously not going to go through everything I was going to go through today. But let me get to a quote of Bertrand Russell. If I can find Bertrand Russell here, I can find Bertrand Russell. Oh boy, I blew the quote of Bertrand Russell. However, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to read the quote of Bertrand Russell. Okay, basically, Bertrand Russell was delighted when he discovered Darwin's theory of evolution. He was pretty contemporary with it. Because it gave him the license to give himself over to his passions and to basically have no need to listen to a voice of conscience. And the quote from him is the following: "Having been, I can bring up a picture of him. Whoops, although I can't bring up the quote. But there's a picture of Bertrand Russell, and the quote is, having been forced, as everyone must who seriously thinks about evolution, to give up the old idea of consulting one's conscience, next it seems to me that happiness is the great thing to seek after." And in the case of Bertrand Russell, that happiness was in sexual licentiousness. Anyway, so back to Spinoza or post-Spinoza. So he had pantheism as a kind of weak link to holding on to the concept of God in a way that did not present any real life implications. Okay, so however, this scientific revolution that was the groundwork for the Enlightenment enabled the Enlightenment to come about, because it basically resulted in mankind feeling like we've looked behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz or whatever. We've looked behind the curtain. We now don't see everything as coming from the hand of God. We actually see things in their own right as how they work. We have the answers to everything in science. We no longer kind of need God. We no longer need the concept of revelation to teach us anything. It was an exaltation of reason, of the power of man's reason, to basically replace religion. Now, I will get soon to the French Revolution, which was really the Enlightenment turned political. But let me try to kind of skate through just this premise I'm making about the Enlightenment. Okay, first of all, note, the scientists themselves were religious. It's not them who did away with the notion of God. However, people now had an alternative to believing to looking at everything as being the direct action of God. They had the divine clockmaker, they had pantheism, they had this bizarre sense that the universe itself explained itself because it followed its own laws. Now, these discoveries were made by the scientific method, so to speak, of careful observation, experiments, repetition. And it had yielded this revolution in society. Because, of course, this science didn't only yield a revolution in science, it yielded a revolution in the benefits of mankind, in medicine, the steam engine, the calculator that I showed you from Leibniz. There was a continual stream of improvement in man's state that came from science. So all of a sudden, science wasn't only the explainer of the state of man, but it was also the benefactor of the state of man. So you can see why there was a kind of inclination to, I'll call it like scientism, like a religion of science, and turning science into a religion. And the fundaments of science were that we gain knowledge not by revelation and not by doctrine and dogma, but from scientists through careful experimentation and measurement. And of course, the gold standard for the scientific method, what became known as the scientific method much later, is experimentation, measurement, and repeatability of experiments, which is a fine methodology if you want to know, what causes chemical reactions or what causes larvae to grow on rotten meat and so forth. However, the problem with the scientific method, if you stop to think about it, is the scientific method is predicated on arbitrary repeatability of experiments. Now, whenever you have free will, you don't have arbitrary repeatability of experiments, okay? My neighbor may come to me today and ask to borrow a cup of sugar, and I say, sure. And he may come to me tomorrow, another neighbor, who I have a beef with, and ask to borrow a cup of sugar, and I may say no. Or the same neighbor may come to me, but I'm in a really foul temper because I didn't have my morning coffee yet, and I may say no, get lost. Whenever there's free will, there isn't arbitrary repeatability. And that's true if the repetition, if the repeating depends on the free will of a person like yours truly, the free will of an angel, the free will of a demon, or the free will of God. So by definition, whenever you have anything that comes from an act of God, i.e. a miracle, it's not arbitrarily repeatable. One person who has cancer may pray to God and for a healing, and for one reason or another, God may grant them a miraculous healing. And another person may pray and not be granted a healing. The same thing with going to Lourdes and immersing oneself in the baths of Lourdes. There are thousands of totally miraculous documented healings, but that doesn't mean that everyone is guaranteed one. Because there's a free will component, right? You can see how free will negates the scientific method. However, in our culture, nothing is true unless it's subject to the scientific method. Science is the only means through which one can establish truth. You see how ridiculous that is? Anyway, you end up getting to this statement that if I don't care how much reliable evidence there is, if I can't repeat it in a laboratory, it doesn't exist. Now, let me give a little digression here. This scientism was very transparently abused recently in the case of COVID-19 because there were thousands of anecdotes. Anecdotes means eyewitnesses. Anecdotes means actual evidence of how hydroxychloroquine in conjunction with zinc and the right antibiotic was a very effective treatment for COVID-19 until very late stages. There were thousands and thousands of patients who had responded extremely positively. There was a U.S. congresswoman, she might have been a state congresswoman, who was at death's door, who was healed overnight. by an administration of those drugs. And she went on TV and said, I'm only alive today because I received those drugs. The establishment that was determined to use COVID-19 as a springboard to have universal vaccination totally rejected what they called anecdotal evidence. Come on, it's evidence, but it didn't count because it wasn't a double-blind study under a controlled conditions. So I hate to say it, but thousands of people died and suffered horribly, unnecessarily. In France, the use of hydroxychloroquine was outlawed to be used for COVID-19. In Illinois, the governor outlawed its use for COVID-19. And yet, you can find any number of really serious virologists, with PhDs down their arms on the internet, emergency room doctors, just attesting to the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine with the right, whatever we call it, protocol for COVID-19 patients nearly up to the very end. Another example of saying if it isn't a repeatable experiment, according to the protocol that we like to use for refereed journals, it's not the truth. Although in this case, I don't think they honestly believed it. In this case, I think it was a transparent manipulation. Anyway, there's a very funny case of Émile Zola, who was a very famous journalist at the turn of the century in France, who went to Lourdes to write a book debunking the miracles, the medical miracle healings at Lourdes. Unfortunately for him, in the train down there, he was in a car with a woman who had a cancer of her face that had eaten away half of her face. It was really horrible to behold. And when she was submerged in the waters of Lourdes, she had a miraculous healing, and the cancer disappeared and her face went back to normal. So what did Émile Zola do? Did he say, I was wrong, there are miraculous healings? No. He maintained that there are no miraculous healings, and he pensioned off this woman. I don't think she agreed to it. I don't remember whether she agreed to it, but he visited her in Paris and tried to bribe her and her husband, who were very poor, to disappear to a village in Belgium and never be seen again, so that he could maintain that she had not been healed. And he said, quote, I don't care how many miracles I see, I still won't believe it. Something like that. And I'll just finish this with a quote by G.K. Chesterton, who I probably haven't put up the quote either. But let me find the direct quote by Chesterton, if I have it. And if I don't, I will simply have to, again, ad-lib it. Yes, sorry. He said, basically, rightly or wrongly, those who believe in miracles believe in them on the basis of the evidence. And rightly or wrongly, those who do not believe in miracles refuse to believe in them on the basis of faith. Okay? It's exactly the opposite of a genuine scientific attitude. Anyway, so, okay. Oh yeah, just because it's so much fun, a scientific proof of the Catholic faith. This is kind of a digression. I'll never get anywhere in these shows, but I had to show you this. Okay, because we as Catholics, we not only have medical miracle healings like at Lourdes and other miracles seen by 70, 100,000 people, like the sun dancing in the sky and falling to earth at Fatima. I mean, how much evidence do you need, guys? But apparently that's not repeatable, right? We can't ask the Blessed Virgin Mary to do that again tomorrow, so it couldn't have happened, right? Anyway, we have Eucharistic miracles, which are really neat because they very specifically prove the truth of the Catholic faith, like the transubstantiation of the Eucharist, that under the form of wafer, it actually becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of the second person of the Most Holy Trinity. So there was a Polish miracle in 2008 in Poland, a Eucharistic miracle. 2008. We're not talking about superstitious peasants in the Middle Ages. This miracle was subjected to the full battery of scientific examination, okay? I'll put up some slides because I actually do have them that talk about that miracle. Okay, October 12th, 2008, Polish priest celebrated Mass in the presence of 200 people. Host fell to the ground. He picked it up and placed it in a small vessel of water so that it would dissolve, and left the vessel in the sacristy safe for 2 weeks. But it had not dissolved, but rather a shape resembling a bloodstain had emerged on it. And in fact, also something adjacent to the bloodstain and connected to the wafer that looked like organic material. Let me pull up the next slide. He called the bishop in to witness it. The bishop called in 2 professors of medicine at the University of Bialystok. Both of them had worked in the field of histopathology for over 30 years. After working separately, they arrived at the same conclusion. What had been given them to examine had come from human heart muscle that had been still alive, but in agony. Professor Sulkowski stated that he had observed the presence of many typical biomorphological indicators of heart muscle tissue, as well as visible damage in the form of tiny ruptures to fibers of the tissue. He added, such changes can be observed only in living fibers, and they show evidence of rapid spasms of the heart muscle in the period just before death. Okay? So not only was it human tissue, not only was it human muscle tissue, not only was it human heart muscle tissue, but it was human heart muscle tissue taken just before death of somebody dying in agony. Professor Sobianish Lotoshka confirmed this is living heart muscle tissue. She was astonished that it had remained alive after being separated from the organism, because it should have immediately dried out, but they didn't observe any of that. And according to the current state of knowledge, it cannot be explained scientifically. And she was also very intrigued by the way the heart muscle tissue was connected to the consecrated host, and declared that the extraordinary phenomenon of interabsorption of the heart muscle tissue with the host, absorbed under the microscope and also by electron microscopy, proves that no human manipulation of the sample could have taken place. In fact, the structure of the myocardial fibers and the structure of the bread were bound so tightly together that no human intervention could have caused it. Moreover, the blood from the host had the same characteristics of the blood from the Shroud of Turin and from the miracle of Lanciano. They were all group AB. And now let me show you a picture of that miracle. So there you see it. That's an actual picture. You see on the far left some of the host. Looks like some of it dissolved in the water, but you see a substantial amount of pale yellow host. And then you see it morphs on a cellular level. It morphs into human muscle tissue, which you see to the right. Which has not died out, by the way. The blood is still red. It has not dried out. And the quote from the laboratory analysis, that the laboratory analyses confirm that the structure of the cardiac muscle fibers and the structure of the bread are intertwined in a way impossible to reproduce by human means. Okay? So take that, skeptics. Now, a genuine scientific attitude would be, okay, we have a hypothesis, we have a theory that can explain the evidence. It's called the Catholic faith. Okay, you don't have to take our word for it. You don't have to believe in the Catholic faith. But if you want to really be scientific about it, come up with an alternative hypothesis, okay, that can explain it. And if you can't, I'm sorry, but you kind of have no alternative than to accept the Catholic faith's explanation of it. So there you have that. Now I'm going to do something I probably shouldn't do, but I'm going to try to improve the picture a little bit. So so let me see if I can do that in real time here. And let's see if this improves any. Okay, so let's see. Let's up that a little bit. And let's up this a little bit. This is actually what was bothering me. And okay, there. Okay, so there we have it. Maybe I overdid it there. Probably overdid it there. This is the problem with being a nerd at heart. I just like nerding too much. Forgive me. I'll try to mortify that. Okay, I'll settle in now. Okay, so that was the I guess that was kind of the scientific revolution, scientism, the excuse for not believing in God so that people could be immoral and so forth. Okay, so okay, I kind of did that. Good, I got through that without a disaster so far. Okay, now we have the Enlightenment, which is kind of beginning of the 18th century, and it was an intellectual movement, and it was an intellectual movement which was spawned in intellectual circles and Masonic circles, and that is not a secret. Here is a passage on the Enlightenment from Wikipedia. That's no friend of Catholic conspiracy theorists, okay? Enlightenment is traditionally dated from the beginning of the 18th century to the beginning of the 19th century. Philosophers and scientists of the period widely circulated their ideas through meetings at scientific academies, Masonic lodges, okay? I highlighted that. Masonic lodges, literary salons, coffee houses, printed books, pamphlets, and journals. The ideas of the Enlightenment undermined the authority of the monarchy and the church and paved the way for the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. The Enlightenment included a range of ideas centered on the sovereignty of reason and the evidence of the senses as the primary sources of knowledge, and advanced ideals such as liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. In France, the central doctrines of the Enlightenment philosophers were individual liberty and religious tolerance, in opposition to absolute monarchy and the fixed dogmas of the Catholic Church. I can't go on without pointing out how dishonest this is, because the religious tolerance within about 20 years involved killing tens of thousands of priests and religious, and exiling 30,000, and mass murder of anyone who was religious. I mean, that's hardly religious tolerance. But anyway, the ideals of religious tolerance. The Enlightenment was marked by an emphasis on scientific method and reductionism, along with increased questioning of religious orthodoxy. So I pulled up that quote to show that it's inseparable, that the revolution against the Catholic Church, the revolution against Catholic monarchy, that swept all of Europe from the French Revolution, began with the French Revolution, and within 100 years or so after the French Revolution, it had conquered Europe entirely. In other words, Europe, which until the French Revolution, every monarch had ruled by the authority of the Pope. Often they had to be crowned by the Pope or the Bishop to be monarch. It had all been swept away in this wave of revolution that required the scientific revolution, that required the Enlightenment, which was this bastardization of actually the scientific revolution, turning it into an alternative to God, whereas the scientists behind it never turned it into an alternative to God. Ended up with basically removing all of the prerogatives from the Catholic Church. Those revolutions were by and large largely orchestrated by Masonic lodges, perhaps always orchestrated by Masonic lodges. There's no question about the French Revolution. There's no question about the Risorgimento that took over the Papal States. They were generally aided by the Jews. In other words, the Jews were always on the side of those revolutions. Now, the Jews were on the side of the revolutions not for the same reason that the Masons were on the side of the revolutions. Actually, that the Masons instituted the revolutions. The Masons instituted the revolutions because they wanted the separation of church and state. They wanted the overthrow of the church. The overthrow of the church is the fundamental purpose of the Masons. It was a means. The Enlightenment was a means to, or it was a mechanism through which largely the Masons, but also other people in society, could take the scientific revolution and use it as an excuse to overthrow the church, overthrow Catholic faith, overthrow Catholic dogma, overthrow the authority of the church in temporal affairs, overthrow the Catholic monarchies, create this separation of church and state, and create republican and democratic forms of government instead of the monarchies. The Masonic intention was clear. Now, if anyone wants to argue that maybe the Masons were like that in those days, but they aren't like that today, I will point out that the Catholic Prohibition, I'm looking for the, so that's the problem. If I go out of the order, I lose the order of the slides. So I'm looking for the slide that shows it was always prohibited since the beginning of the 18th century for Catholics to be Masons. Okay, so, and it was repeated as recently as 1983. So here is a little summary. Membership in the Masons was forbidden by canon law since 1738, Pope Clement XII's bull In Eminent Apostolatus. In the 1917 Code of Canon Law and Code 2335, it stated that those who join a Masonic sect incur ipso facto in excommunication. In other words, by the very fact they are under excommunication, which was repeated in 1983 by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under the prefect Ratzinger. And the Declaration on Masonic Associations, quote, Catholics who join Masonic organizations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion. In other words, they're excommunicated. So the Masonic, the purpose of the Masons, certainly for the last 500 years, was to overthrow the Catholic Church. And they succeeded in a political way in the revolutions from the Enlightenment to a century later, the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. And I will argue that today they are trying to, I can use French because we're talking about the French Revolution, execute the coup de grace, the final blow, and replace, actually create the one world government under essentially Masonic control that will replace all the national governments and create a one world church, a universal church of the brotherhood of mankind that will replace all of the different religions. And I suspect we're seeing that executed today. That's another reason for liking that letter I read at the beginning of the show. That is, I believe, that is the plot that's unfolding before our very eyes. And the pandemic or plandemic was definitely a part of it. The universal forced vaccination would be a part of it if it came about. I believe the turning over the church in China to the communist Chinese government, whose expressed intention is to wipe out religion, ask me what sense that makes, or don't ask me what sense that makes, is a part of it. The garden, what's it called? The Garden of Abraham that's being built in the Islamic Middle East, with the House of Abraham for the Jews and the House of Ishmael or whatever for the Muslims, and I don't know what they call it, but the center for the three monotheistic world religions for Judaism and Islam and the Catholic Church to all unite at this worldwide religious center, unifying the three religions as a part of it. Anyway, I think that we're seeing it, and that's why this show has to intertwine the news of the day, whether one likes it or not, with the news of the 18th century. So back to the French Revolution, which was a Masonic plot. And there's a wonderful book. I was going to recommend you run out and buy it, but unfortunately it's out of print and overpriced right now. It's called The Guillotine and the Cross by Warren Carroll. I fortunately bought some copies when they were still $6 or $7 each, and I'm trying to negotiate with the copyright owner to republish it. I think they will republish it as Christendom Press. But it is a very Catholic, very readable short history of the French Revolution that talks about the plotting of the leaders of the revolution taking place in the Masonic Lodge in Paris, under a severed head, by the way. I forgot whose head it was. No question it was a Masonic plot. Now, the French Revolution, I know that, in our high school, we were probably taught that it was all about, the distribution of wealth, right? The king was really rich. The nobles were really rich. The people were really poor. They were fed up with it. They didn't have enough bread to eat, so they overthrew the king. But that isn't what it was. It was really the Masons overthrowing the church. And it was so anti-religion, you wouldn't believe it, an anti-church. And so I will go through a little bit of history. This is really neat. You'll have to excuse this piece of it. I have to finish because of my mass, so I'm going to have to finish in a half an hour. But the King of France was always anointed by sacred oil that came directly from heaven. The way I heard it from a very holy Jesuit priest that it came from St. Michael. There are other stories that it came from the Holy Spirit, but it came at the baptism of Clovis, who was like the first French king. We're talking about the 5th century, okay? We're talking about 400 years after the death of Christ. The King of France converted to Catholicism, and at his baptism, which was done by a bishop, he was anointed with, as king, I believe, with holy oil, holy chrism, which descended to the altar because the bishop didn't have any to use, descended to the altar in a sacred vial, which was kept from them then until the French Revolution. And no French king from the 5th century until the French Revolution could be made king without being anointed with his oil that came straight from heaven in the holy vial, the sacred ampoule in French. So I will show here. I'll show a 9th century carving of the Clovis being anointed by the bishop with this holy oil that descended from heaven. You see that is a picture of the Holy Spirit, of a dove there. And that seems to be the general story of how it appeared on the altar. And unfortunately, that priest has passed away, so I can't try to recover the story from him and find out the pros and cons of the two stories. But in any case, the kings of France were not kings of France unless they were anointed with this holy oil that came straight from heaven. So anyway, you can see the theological centrality of the monarchy in France. Now, the French Revolution was so directly anti-church that, let me turn to my notes here. Okay, they want to do away with everything having to do with the Catholic Church, which means, of course, they want to do away with the priests. So basically, a priest had to swear allegiance to the new state religion, which was basically made a goddess out of reason, or he would be killed, or 30,000 were exiled. I guess those were the lucky ones, but there were probably at least another 10,000 priests and religious who were martyred. And so that's how anti-religion it was. Because it wanted people not to observe Sundays, it changed the week to 10 days, so there would be no Sunday. It changed the months of the calendar, so there'd be no way of knowing when the feast days were, Christmas and so forth. It destroyed a lot of churches. I have a picture of one of the churches that was destroyed by the revolution, St. Bartholomew's Church. It's just a 18th century or 19th century painting of the destruction of the church. You can see that the top was burned off, or they were turned into temples of reason. And in fact, Notre Dame of Paris, I believe that there was a red scaffolding, red box put around the steeple, and it was turned into a temple to the goddess Reason. And I have here an etching of the goddess Reason being processed into Notre Dame in Paris to be enthroned on the high altar. The accounts I read were that she was topless. I don't know. I don't think that drawing shows her as topless. And she was a prostitute. And she was enthroned on the altar as the goddess of reason to make a mockery and sacrilege of the Catholic Church. Many priests and religious, of course, were executed in the normal way by guillotine, but they couldn't keep up with them by guillotine. And so they had a tradition or a system known as noyade, which means drownings. And in the noyade, this took place mostly in Nantes, in the Vendée, which was the region of France that held to the Catholic faith most fervently, and actually tried to launch a counter-revolution, which came pretty close to succeeding, of an army of peasants armed just with scythes and farm implements that marched on Paris. Anyway, so the revolution was particularly severe in the Vendée, and there they drowned all of the priests and religious in these mass drownings. Noyades means drownings, where basically they would load them onto barges and take the barges out to the middle of the river and drown all of the priests and religious. And that wasn't enough just to drown them. Let's see what we have here. They had to also make a sacrilege and a blasphemy out of this. So they stripped them as they were forcing them onto the barges and then forcing them from the barges into the water to drown. And in a kind of particular, typical, if I can say so, satanic maneuver, they instituted what they called underwater marriages. And they would actually do would be the priests, these would be priests and nuns, and they would have been stripped naked, and they would actually tie them together and drown them together just to increase the sacrilege of it, and to mock them as as though they were being impure, and as though this was somehow therefore what they called an underwater marriage, that somehow they would be unchaste in the process of being executed by this drowning. Pretty gross, huh? Well, can I say, if the bad guys succeed these days, you ain't seen nothing yet, because the devil hasn't changed. Yeah, the devil hasn't changed. So anyway, we saw this with Islam, right? In the heyday of Al-Qaeda and Iraq and the Coptic Christians, being burned alive and being drowned actually in cages. Remember, they did that too. And being burned alive and so forth. The cruelty is satanic. You saw it actually. I'll argue in the death camps too, in the Holocaust. The sadism had a demonic quality to it. It was not a kind of human kind of cruelty. Anyway. Okay, so where did this Enlightenment overthrow of the monarchy come from? What was its impetus? And it's absolutely necessary to mention this now. It was premised on the negation of original sin, and it was premised on the ridiculous premise that man is intrinsically good and he does not need a force of authority over him to keep society behaving. That society, left to its own devices, essentially without government, without authority, will be good and noble. And The only thing that makes man behave selfishly or cruelly or whatever is the fact that he's being abused by those in authority. And if they just left him alone, there would be no crime, there would be no cheating, there would be no selfishness, okay? The noble savage. I mean, if you're into this stuff, you know about Rousseau. He was a writer of the Enlightenment who presented this, that it's basically civilization that makes man base. That original sin comes from civilization. It doesn't come from the nature of man. Why do I have to mention this today? Because the Minneapolis City Council voted to defund the police. The New York City mayor announced that he was going to cut down the funding of the police and send that money instead to neighborhood help programs or whatever, okay? We don't need the police. That's actually being said in the halls of Congress by Democrat congressmen. Defund the police. Defund the police. Really? Just go to Google. I don't know if Google will do it honestly. And go to Google News and type in defund the police. You'll see what I'm talking about. There's nothing new under the sun, as Ecclesiasticus said. Defund the police. It's already back there in Rousseau. It's back there in the French Revolution. And you saw the results in the French Revolution, because what you had this in the Russian Revolution also. Okay, they deposed the king. They cut off their heads. There's a group of revolutionaries, running the revolution. 6 months later, another group of revolutionaries come up. They cut off the heads of all of the revolutionaries running the revolution. They take their place for 6 months until their heads are all cut off by the next gang who get control. The same thing in Bolshevik Russia. Trotsky, right, was executed, by the next wave. Anyway, I don't have that history down pat, so don't quote me on that. I know that he was executed, but I'm not sure of what the background was. People's nobility don't come out when you remove authority. Their fallen human nature comes out. Protests against abuse of police authority against minorities is a noble thing to do. But what's that got to do with destroying neighborhoods and looting stores and killing or injuring or maiming random policemen and random people of the wrong race, and destroying their livelihoods and their life savings and everything? Okay, that's not protesting injustice. That is when, in the absence of all authority, it does not erase man's fallen nature. It exacerbates man's fallen nature, okay? Anyway, just like Animal Farm, amen. Okay, I'm occasionally glancing at the chat stream. So anyway. So so if you remove authority, you don't end up with a peaceful utopian commune. You end up with a thugocracy, where basically warlords, where the person who exercises the most force gets to lord it over everybody else. So, okay, I'll go on very quickly to the Jews, because that's what the show was supposed to be about. The Jews were on the wrong side, one can say, in all of these revolutions. They were on the side of the revolutions, but for better reasons than the Masons, because the Masons were on the side of the revolutions to overthrow the church. The Jews were on the side of the revolutions to get what's called emancipation, because they had no civil rights anywhere in Europe, except to a limited extent in Poland, for about the last 1,200 years, 1,500 years. There were periodic expulsions when they were expelled from every place they lived, and not because they had done anything bad or were, bad citizens, but just because of political, theological trends. And I've shown this map before. Expelled from Portugal, expelled from Spain, expelled from France, expelled from England, expelled from Wales, expelled from the Papal States, expelled from Sardinia, expelled from Hungary, expelled from Crimea, and so forth and so on. They were pushed all around. They had no civil rights. They only got emancipated through the revolutions and from the revolutions. And in fact, if you look at the years in which they were emancipated, you see that very clearly, with the exception of Poland and the United States, actually. They were emancipated in the United States. They got full civil rights in 1790, as soon as under Washington. Anyway, in France in 1791, right after the French Revolution, then Belgium, Greece, Netherlands, Ottoman Empire, German states, and so forth and so on. It just came in the wake of the revolutions. So yeah, the Jews were bad guys. They sided with the revolutions, but they were siding where I think any reasonable person would be, which was they were siding for their own emancipation, for their own civil rights, not per se to overthrow the church, but they were bedfellows with the Masons, so to speak, at least fighting on the same side. Not that I think there was any concerted conspiracy between the two, but they were fighting on the same side. And I got to admit, sometimes Jewish money was involved. There was the House of Rothschild in those days. There were wealthy Jewish banks, and those wealthy Jewish banks sometimes bankrolled the revolutionary forces, trying to overthrow the monarchies and promising the Jews emancipation if they succeeded, and the Jews getting emancipation if they succeeded. And in fact, in the Papal States, which was most of Italy, they were separate states: Naples, Padua, Rome, Genoa, Bergamo, and so forth. They were all independent little kingdoms. They were all part of the Papal States. The Jews were never emancipated in them. They never got civil rights in them until, in fact, the Italian Revolution succeeded and overthrew the Papal States in 1871. That's the first time that the Jews in Italy had civil rights. So anyway, you can see why the Jews were on the wrong side there. Anyway, I just want to make that clear because people do talk about the revolutionary Jews and the Masonic Jewish conspiracy, and I wanted to paint the backdrop there. And in fact, the lack of emancipation of the Jews was at the behest of the Catholic Church. In particular, there were many papal documents, but there was one notorious one from 1551 that established the ghettos in the Papal States and also basically said that it was improper for Christian society to allow the Jews to mingle in Christian society. They had to wear special dress so they could be identified. They had to live in special places and be locked into the ghetto overnight. They couldn't have normal professions or careers or so forth, but they were limited to rag picking and selling secondhand goods and lending money and so forth. So anyway, there was a lot of restriction on the Jews, and that kind of, if you ask me, pushed them to take the side that they did in these revolutions. Now, having said that, the Enlightenment also had a very negative they're great comments. I don't have the attention, I can't divert my attention, but I want to thank you because I enjoy reading them. And after the show, I always read them all, and I'm very impressed by them. Anyway, the Enlightenment had a terrible negative effect on Judaism also. And that's where I'm going to have to end the show. Because, of course, it permeated Judaism too. And by the way, it had Spinoza, who was a Jew, and it had his, pantheism that actually helped to get a foothold in Judaism. And so let me just turn to the closing section here, which is, it basically had a disastrous effect on Judaism. Two things simultaneously had a disastrous effect. Emancipation, which the Jews wanted so badly, basically civil rights, being made full citizens, actually had a terrible effect on Judaism, because until the emancipation of the Jews, they had to be separate, right? They were kept in ghettos. They had no world they could live in other than the Jewish world. So they had to conform to the Jewish laws, of dress and of being kosher and of not mingling with Gentiles and of so forth. Now, all of a sudden, they were free to be just like the Gentiles. Many of them wanted to be. They wanted to be university professors. They wanted to dress like the Gentiles. They wanted to eat at banquets with the Gentiles. They didn't want to be different. They didn't want to be sneered at They didn't even want to be identifiably Jews in many cases, okay? They just wanted to go along and get along and be like everyone else, which meant they could not follow the Jewish laws. They still had some desire to maintain their identity as Jews, so they came up with Reform Judaism. So Reform Judaism had these two streams flowing into it. One was the emancipation itself, which of course lit this fire in their hearts to fit into society, which they couldn't if they were as Jewish as Jewish law would require them to be. And the other stream was the Enlightenment, which told them that, basically there is no divine revelation. God can be explained away by science. What's it called? What's the term for it? Higher criticism, higher biblical criticism, which the Protestants had adopted wholesale. That the scriptures were not given by God, but they were written by different people at different points in time. You can see contradictions in them. You can see the hands of different authors that didn't always agree and so forth. This higher biblical criticism made their way into Judaism too. So basically, they could throw away everything and they could invent a new Judaism, Reform Judaism, that let them have their cake and eat it too, let them claim to still be Jews, but I'll go through some of the principles of Reform Judaism. It replaced the traditional Jewish liturgy with a vernacular, with basically German in Germany or English in the United States and so forth. It allowed the individual to decide for themselves which laws they wanted to follow and which laws they didn't want to follow. Came to the American version where spare ribs, pork is not kosher except for spare ribs in Chinese restaurants for some reason. Really, a lot of friends of mine, family growing up, held to that particular version of kashrut. My own parents, by the way, my mother, pork wasn't kosher, but shellfish was. Anyway, I'm not here to slam my parents, but it really took off. It replaced the traditional Hebrew liturgy. It rebuilt the synagogues, actually, to look more like Protestant churches. Applied modern higher criticism to the understanding of Scripture. In other words, anything goes, it doesn't come from God. And embraced the customs, mores, and dress of modern culture, and it replaced the Jewish emphasis on ritual observance and worship with social justice. Do I hear modern Catholic Church, anyone? Okay? That's another reason for these shows. I mean, the devil is the devil. He follows the same strategies, different points in time, different religious groups, and so forth. With the Catholic Church is more tragic because he's replacing a God-given religion with this mishigas, with this nonsense. In the case of Rabbinic Judaism, he was at least replacing only a man-made, earnest attempt to reach God with this mishigas, or nonsense. Mishigas is Yiddish for craziness. Anyway, the Reform movement is usually considered to have been introduced by this German rabbi who started out as an Orthodox rabbi, Abraham Geiger. He became the chief rabbi of Breslau in 1840. But anyway, he ended up losing his faith, essentially, and coming up with this Reform Judaism. As I said, he was made the chief rabbi in 1840. Reform Judaism emerged pretty much in the 1830s, 1840s. In the United States, it was hardly embraced a few decades later. And there's a very famous incident, okay? I got to put my face back on because I'm cracking up, so I want to be able to share that with you. Okay, so here we have basically the Jews in the United States in Pittsburgh established a new Jewish seminary to ordain Jewish rabbis. Not traditional rabbis, but more along the lines of Reform Judaism, right? So they had their first graduating class in, where is the year? 1884, I believe. Yeah, I believe it's 1884. I don't have the year here. 1883, 1884. They had their first graduating class. 4 new graduates of the Hebrew. If I don't have notes, I don't have the Hebrew Union College. Foundation of the Hebrew Union College is the name of the school. And here is they had a big banquet to celebrate the graduation of their first 4 new rabbis. And I'm going to close with a screenshot of the menu from the banquet, okay? Okay, now I don't know how many Jews there are out there, but they'll find this hilarious. Okay, the appetizer is little neck clams, not kosher. The fish course is soft-shelled crabs with shrimp salad, not kosher, not kosher. Entree sweetbreads, I think not kosher. I can't guarantee that. Then the second course is frog legs in cream and cauliflower, cream sauce and cauliflower, not kosher. The hors d'oeuvres, I'm trying to understand what this is, and I can't identify them all. And the dessert is ice cream, which of course is not kosher, eaten at a meal with meat, and there was plenty of meat there. There was chicken, there was beef, there was veal, and there were sweetbreads. Okay, so you could not, if you wanted to, create a more unkosher menu. Oh, pork seems to be missing, actually. They probably felt that it would offend their sensibilities to actually have a roast loin of pork out there. Yes, that is a very funny menu. But anyway, that is kind of my, okay, my final dig at Reformed Judaism to close the show with. So anyway, I mean, I have a lot of fun with these shows, but I think I have to laugh because otherwise I would be crying because everything that is going on is so tragic. Except, by the way, for one thing, which is God's in charge, and we are on our way to heaven. So that's not tragic. But the number of people who are being lost today, the number of people who are being deprived of relationship with God because they're in Judaism rather than in the true form of Judaism, which of course is the Catholic Church. I have to pull up this slide for a few moments. The Catholics who are being led astray, the Protestants who are being led astray, the communists, the Chinese who don't have a chance at the true faith, the sin that abounds, requiring God to chastise mankind. It's all very tragic. So let's close with a prayer. I'll just close with the St. Michael prayer because I don't want to make this too Jewish chauvinist. This show had a lot of tragedy to Catholics also, obviously. So for once, I'll just close with the St. Michael prayer and with a Hail Mary. You can see her back there, lit up with a candle. So St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who patrol the world, seeking the ruin and destruction of souls. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. And I united that Hail Mary with that beautiful, beautiful, beautiful image of the President of the United States humbly on his knees before the Blessed Virgin Mary at a shrine, praying the Hail Mary. So I'm going to repeat it in union with that prayer of our President for peace and prosperity and sanity and religious freedom in the country that he is the president of and we are blessed to live in, the United States of America. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Amen. Thank you. I know many of you are not in the United States of America, so I didn't mean to diss you. Thank you, especially for tuning in. And I hope you join me again for the next show. I think it'll be Friday, but I can't guarantee it. So keep posted on the YouTube channel. Anyway, thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see you again. Bye for now. Keep praying. Bye for now.